On May 23, 2019, at 27,000 feet on Mount Everest, a climber struggles to take one more step downward. Her legs simply refuse to obey. The wind howls past her face mask at 40 miles per hour, and her goggles fog up with every labored breath. Each movement feels like wading through thick concrete. Just 3 hours earlier, she had stood triumphantly on the summit of the world, arms raised high, smiling for the camera. The hardest part was supposed to be behind her. She had reached the top. She had won. So why was her body now shutting down? A short distance below, her Sherpa's face twists with a mix of panic and quiet resignation. He already understands what she cannot yet grasp. He had known the truth 18 hours earlier, when they had passed this very spot on the way up, and he had pleaded with her to turn back. Her oxygen-starved brain could no longer process the warning, but he knew. She had been dead for hours. She simply did not realize it yet. This is the story of Kalpana Dash. If you had told 30-year-old Kalpana Dash that one day she would stand on the summit of Mount Everest, she probably would have laughed in your face. Nothing in her background hinted at a future as an elite mountaineer. She was born on July 7, 1966, in a modest neighborhood in Dhenkanal, Odisha, a small town in eastern India about 50 miles from the state capital. Dhenkanal was famous for its temples, forested hills, and marble trade. Not exactly a breeding ground for world-class climbers. Her father was not rich or well-connected, but he loved the outdoors. On weekends, he would take young Kalpana hiking through the local hills, including the trails up to Kapila's Peak, a gentle mountain crowned with a temple that attracted pilgrims rather than mountaineers. They climbed in ordinary shoes with no special equipment, just a father and daughter strolling through the forest. Her mother was the heart of the family. Traditional, devoted, and determined that her daughter should enjoy stability and security. Kalpana delivered exactly that. She was a strong student and earned her law degree in 1991. By her mid-20s, she was a practicing lawyer, married to Dr. Srikant Dash, and living a comfortable middle-class life in a small Indian town. She appeared in court, handled cases, and followed the path her mother had always hoped for her. If you had met Kalpana in 1996 at the age of 30, nothing about her would have suggested that within a decade she would be standing on the roof of the world. At that time, she was simply a lawyer who enjoyed hiking. That was all. But something inside her began to change. Perhaps it was the memory of those childhood walks with her father. Perhaps it was the quiet restlessness that comes when a stable life starts to feel too small. Whatever the reason, in 2001, at the age of 35, Kalpana Dash enrolled in a basic mountaineering course at the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Darjeeling. Starting such a demanding sport at 35 is almost unheard of, especially in high-altitude mountaineering, where every extra year of age steals a little more lung capacity, slows muscle recovery, and makes the body less able to adapt to extreme conditions. To put it in perspective, legends like Reinhold Messner summit their first major peaks in their early 20s. Ed Viesturs began serious climbing at 16. Junko Tabei, the first woman to reach Everest's summit, started at 22. By 35, many climbers have already tackled multiple peaks above 26,000 feet, and some are already beginning to age out of the sport. The physical prime for endurance athletics usually falls in the late 20s to early 30s. After that, recovery slows and injuries pile up. Yet Kalpana would spend the next 18 years proving that age is only a number if you are willing to endure more pain and hardship than anyone else around you. In 2001, she completed the basic mountaineering course at the Institute, 28 days of technical rope work, ice climbing, crevasse rescue, and high-altitude acclimatization. She was learning skills at 35 that most of her classmates had practiced since their teenage years. The following year, in 2002, she returned for the advanced course, another 28 days of climbing sharp ice walls and rugged terrain. Slowly, over the next few years, she built her skills one certification at a time while still working as a lawyer and managing a household. What makes her story even more extraordinary is that Kalpana did not train the way wealthy or professional climbers do. Elite training demands specialized gear, time away from work, and repeated trips year after year. In India, unless you are in the military or come from money, that kind of preparation is simply out of reach. So Kalpana improvised. Near her home in Dhenkanal stood Kapila's mountain, the same peak she had climbed as a child with her father. At its base was a Hindu temple reached by 1,352 stone steps carved into the mountainside. Pilgrims climbed those steps to worship. Kalpana climbed them to train. Every single day for years, she strapped a 66-pound backpack onto her shoulders and climbed those 1,352 steps. 5 times up and 5 times down. That meant more than 13,000 steps in a single session, repeated day after day for years. Most people cannot imagine willingly subjecting themselves to that kind of punishment. But when you begin at 35 with no money and no support network, you create your own mountain because you cannot afford the real ones. In 2003, at 37, Kalpana joined an expedition to Mount Satapanth and Mount Bart in Uttarakhand, serious peaks above 22,000 feet that demanded technical skill, high-altitude endurance, and the ability to function in thin air. She summited both. To her, that was proof she could handle real mountains. So she set her sights on Everest. In 2004, at 38, she arrived in Nepal for her first attempt. She had scraped together the money through personal savings, small corporate donations, and loans, an amount greater than most people in Dhenkanal earned in 5 years. She made it through the treacherous Khumbu icefall, the shifting maze of ice towers that claims lives every season. She crossed the western Khum and climbed the Lhotse face. She reached Camp 3 at roughly 23,950 feet, only 2,300 feet below the death zone. Then the weather turned savage, jet stream winds and whiteout conditions that made any summit push suicidal. The team descended. The first attempt had failed, but reaching 23,950 feet at 38 after beginning mountaineering at 35 was already remarkable. Kalpana saw it as a dress rehearsal. Next time she would go farther. In 2006, at 40, she tried again. This time she pushed much higher, reaching Camp 4 at about 26,000 feet and even beginning her summit push. She climbed all the way to 26,400 feet, only 2,600 feet from the top. Once more, weather and low oxygen forced her down. 2 attempts, 2 failures. At this point, most people would have quit, satisfied that they had climbed higher than 99.9% of humanity ever would. But Kalpana was not most people. She felt she had been closer than anyone realized. In 2008, at 42, she prepared for her 3rd attempt. Money remained the biggest obstacle. The expedition cost hundreds of thousands of rupees. Again, more than most people in Dhenkanal earned in 5 years. Permit fees alone were $11,000. Gear, guides, Sherpas, oxygen, food, transport, and lodging added up fast. She wrote letters to the Odisha state government asking for support. They ignored her. She applied for sports ministry grants. Nothing. She contacted the Sports Authority of India. Silence. So Kalpana turned directly to corporations, piecing together funding one small donation at a time and begging each sponsor to believe in her when the government would not. By her own account, her financial situation was fragile and precarious. She was mortgaging her future for a mountain. If she failed a 3rd time, she would be left with nothing but debt. Yet something deeper drove her. She later said she wanted to prove to the entire world that women from Odisha were every bit as capable of facing adventure's challenges. This was about representing her state, her gender, and showing that an ordinary middle-class woman from a small town could stand where only the elite had stood before. And she succeeded. On May 21, 2008, at approximately 11:30 a.m. Nepal time, Kalpana Dash reached the summit of Mount Everest via the southeast ridge route and planted the Indian flag at 29,000 feet. She became the first person from Odisha ever to stand on top of the world. 7 years after beginning mountaineering at 35, after 3 attempts, 2 failures, and 1 triumph, she had only just begun. That summit proved she could climb Everest. It also proved that ignoring doubt worked and that limits could be negotiated. In June 2010, at 44, she successfully summited Mount Denali in Alaska, North America's highest peak. Known for brutal weather, technical difficulty, and only a 50% success rate. In October 2014, she stood on the summit of Kilimanjaro in Africa. Then 2015 became her banner year. In January, she climbed Aconcagua in South America, and in July, she summited Mount Elbrus in Russia. Between 2008 and 2016, Kalpana methodically conquered some of the planet's highest peaks and became one of a small group of Indian women to achieve such a feat, one of the most impressive mountaineering accomplishments in Indian history. For Kalpana, however, it was never only about personal glory. Every summit was a statement. Every photograph carried a message. Women from small Indian towns can do this. Adiya culture deserves recognition. Starting late does not mean you cannot finish strong. In 2017, she took another step that defined her legacy even more powerfully than any summit. She donated every piece of equipment from her 2008 Everest expedition, her climbing suit, oxygen mask, boots, ice axes, everything, to the Odisha State Museum. In her own words, she did it to inspire and motivate girls and women to achieve anything they set their minds to. By 2019, at 52, Kalpana announced she would return to Everest for something historic. She had already summited once in 2008 and had nothing left to prove personally. But this time she was going back with a powerful message. The expedition was called the Three Women Expedition, the first time women from India, Nepal, and China would attempt Everest together as a single team. Kalpana would represent India, Kimi Maya Tamong, Nepal's first woman to summit Everest and a UN Women Goodwill Ambassador, would represent Nepal, and Lamo from China would complete the trio. The legendary Pemba Dorje Sherpa, an 18-time Everest summiteer and Guinness World Record holder, organized the climb. The Nepal Tourism Board described it as groundbreaking, designed to promote Visit Nepal 2020 and highlight women's strength in adventure sports. It was a statement about empowerment, regional cooperation, and breaking barriers. There was also something deeply personal. On Mother's Day, May 12, 2019, Kalpana posted a photograph from Everest Base Camp at 17,500 feet showing her mother, Sila Baladash, the woman who had raised her in that small town, supported her when the government would not, and watched her daughter chase an impossible dream for 18 years. Alongside the picture, Kalpana wrote a message in India, "Bhuishar Everest, Mother, I'm coming from Everest." It was a daughter's promise to her mother, and it would become the phrase that haunts everyone who knows this story. Because Kalpana Dash did come from Everest. She kept her promise. She just did not come home the way she had intended. On May 20th, 2019, at Everest Base Camp, Kalpana stood outside watching the mountain while experienced guides and Sherpas looked on with growing nervousness. Something was wrong with the mountain that spring. First, Cyclone Fani had struck in early May, destroying about 100 tents at Camp 2, burying equipment under 2 feet of snow, and wrecking the entire season's acclimatization schedule. Teams that should have been rotating through the camps were stuck at base camp waiting for the weather to improve. Second, Nepal had issued a record 381 climbing permits that season. Adding Sherpas and support staff meant somewhere between 750 and 900 people were trying to summit during a very narrow window, the busiest the mountain had ever seen. Most critically, the weather window itself was tiny. Normally, Everest offers 7 to 11 clear summit days spread across several weeks in May, allowing teams to stagger their attempts. In 2019, after Cyclone Fani passed, climbers had perhaps only 3 to 5 good days. That forced every expedition that had been waiting for weeks to rush for the summit at the same moment. To anyone who has never climbed big mountains, that might not sound dangerous. But the route up Everest is essentially a single-file trail in most places. Technical sections like the Hillary Step allow only one person at a time. You clip into the fixed rope and climb carefully. If 200 people are ahead of you, you wait. Experienced guides knew exactly what hundreds of climbers attempting the summit simultaneously would mean. Massive delays, traffic jams at 27,000 feet and higher, climbers burning through oxygen while standing still, and people spending 12, 15, or even 18 hours in the death zone when they should be there for only about 10. That kind of exposure kills. Yet Kalpana had summit Everest before. She knew the mountain intimately. In the 11 years since 2008, she had conquered the highest peak on every continent. She had climbed without oxygen on several mountains. At 52, she was one of India's most accomplished female mountaineers. And she was not there for personal glory. She was there to deliver a message about women's empowerment and regional cooperation. The Nepal Tourism Board had called the expedition groundbreaking. The media was watching. So, despite the crowds, the compressed weather window, and the quiet fears of seasoned guides, on May 22, 2019, at approximately 9 p.m., Kalpana and her teammates left Camp 4 for their final summit push. Above them, the mountain vanished into blackness. Somewhere 3,000 feet higher lay the summit. They switched on their headlamps, clipped into the fixed ropes, and began climbing. Their plan was simple: climb through the night, reach the summit around sunrise, and descend with plenty of daylight. A normal summit push takes 10 to 12 hours round trip. That is what the human body can safely endure in the death zone. From the very start, however, Kalpana was moving more slowly than she should have been. Not dramatically at first, just slightly off. Each step took a fraction longer. Each breath sounded heavier. Her Sherpa guides, Jelbu Sherpa and Pembachiri Sherpa, noticed immediately. The pace needed to reach the summit and return safely was missing. Still, they continued upward, hoping she would find her rhythm after an hour or two. She never did. By 2:30 a.m., at around 27,500 feet at a place called the Balcony, Kalpana stopped and leaned against the rock. Her breathing was heavy even at rest. The balcony is usually reached 4 to 5 hours after leaving Camp 4. She had been climbing for 5.5 hours. Ahead of her, Kimmy and Lamo were still moving steadily upward at the pace required for a safe round trip. Below on the rope, Jelbu Sherpa watched with growing alarm. He had seen this pattern before. He climbed up to her. "Didi," he said, using the respectful Hindi term for older sister. "We need to turn around. You are not moving well." Kalpana shook her head. She was only catching her breath. She would be fine in a minute. Her pace was too slow, Jelbu insisted. At this rate, she would not reach the summit until very late. They needed to descend now. But she waved him off and started climbing again. Over the next hour, as she slowly moved above the balcony, both Sherpas repeatedly urged her to turn back. They pointed out her pace, told her how much farther she still had to go, and explained that she could not make it to the summit and back safely at this speed. Every time, Kalpana refused. Imagine her position in that moment. She was 52 years old, an age when most elite climbers are retiring. She had spent 18 years proving she belonged on these mountains. She was not climbing for herself. She was climbing for a message. The media was watching. Her country was watching. This was not just another ascent. It was a statement. Her teammates had already summited and were descending safely. If she turned back now, the expedition would feel incomplete. The photographs would show only 2 women instead of 3. After all the planning, all the media attention, and all the groundbreaking collaboration between 3 countries, she would be the one who did not make it. And there was something deeper. She had summited Everest before. She knew what it took. She was not an inexperienced climber. A voice inside her said, "You are Kalpana Dash. You have done this before. You are just having a slow day. You can push through. You always have." It was not arrogance. It was confidence forged over 18 years of refusing to quit, of proving everyone wrong, of achieving the impossible for a woman from a small town who had started at 35 with no money. So Kalpana made her choice. She kept climbing, hour after hour, step after agonizing step, toward the summit that was so close. What she did not know was that this decision had already sealed her fate. By 9 a.m., Kimmy and Lamo reached the summit. They had climbed for about 12 hours from Camp 4, right on schedule. They took their photographs, raised the Visit Nepal 2020 flag, and immediately began descending because that is what you do on Everest. You do not linger, you get down. But Kalpana was still hundreds of feet below, moving at half the speed she needed. Hour after hour, step after agonizing step. Her oxygen bottles, calculated for a 10 to 12-hour push, were running critically low. By 11 a.m., she had been climbing for 14 hours. Other climbers passed her on their way down, yet she continued upward. Sherpa Jelbu stayed with her, urging her to move faster. At approximately 12:55 p.m. on May 23, 2019, Kalpana Dash reached the summit of Mount Everest for the second time in her life. She had been climbing for nearly 16 hours from Camp 4, 4 to 6 hours longer than normal. She raised her arms in triumph. The Visit Nepal 2020 flag was hoisted. Photographs were taken. For a brief moment, she must have felt on top of the world. All the struggle, all the refusals to turn back, all the hours of suffering had been worth it. She had summited. She had completed the 3-women expedition. She had kept her promise to her mother. But there was no celebration from her Sherpa guides. The maximum survival time in the death zone with supplemental oxygen is roughly 16 to 20 hours. That is not a guideline. It is the threshold where the body shifts from surviving to actively dying. Kalpana had already been above 26,000 feet for 16 hours. She was standing on the summit at the upper limit, and she had not even begun descending. The descent to Camp 4 would take 4 to 5 hours at minimum. At her current pace, it could take 6 or 7, maybe more. That meant she would be in the death zone for 22 to 23 hours, 3 to 7 hours beyond what most mountaineers consider safe. Her oxygen tanks were nearly empty. She had just placed herself in a position where survival was mathematically almost impossible, yet she did not know it yet. Around 1 p.m., when Kalpana began her descent, the first few steps felt wrong. Her right leg responded slowly, as if there were a delay between her brain's command and the muscle's action. She took another step, the same delay. Her breathing, already labored on the summit, grew worse. Each breath felt incomplete. She pulled air through her mask as hard as she could, but it was like breathing through a wet towel. Then the pain began, sharp, deep pain in both legs. Not ordinary muscle fatigue, but something far more serious. Jelbu and Pembachiri immediately moved to her sides, sliding their arms under her shoulders. They were no longer guiding her. They were holding her up. Didi, one step at a time, they told her. They descended slowly, supporting most of her weight. At 29,000 feet, moving is difficult enough when you are healthy. When you are essentially carrying someone, every step becomes a battle. They managed perhaps 200 or 300 feet. Kalpana's legs kept buckling. The Sherpas caught her, lifted her, and kept going. By 2 p.m., they had descended about 600 feet to roughly 28,400 feet. Still deep in the death zone and hours from Camp 4. Kalpana was deteriorating rapidly. Her breathing turned desperate and ragged, like someone drowning. Her legs no longer worked at all. The Sherpas were now carrying and dragging her, moving as fast as they could. At this altitude, fast meant maybe 100 feet per hour while carrying another person. Jelbu looked at her face through her goggles. Her eyes were barely focused. Her skin was turning gray. He had seen this before. He knew time was running out. By 3 p.m., they reached 27,500 feet at the balcony, the exact ledge where, 14 hours earlier on the ascent, Jelbu had begged her to turn around. They lowered Kalpana onto the platform. She collapsed against the rock, her chest heaving with each breath. Jelbu knelt beside her and checked her oxygen mask. The gauge read empty. The bottle had probably run out somewhere between the summit and here. He pulled a spare bottle from his pack, his hands shaking not from cold but from dread. He swapped the bottles and adjusted the flow rate, but nothing changed. Kalpana's breathing slowed. The desperate gasps grew shallower and weaker. Pembachiri moved to her other side, calling her name. Didi, stay with us. We're almost there. But they were not almost there. Camp 4 was still 1,500 feet below them, hours away. Kalpana's body had nothing left. Her breathing became irregular. One gasp, a pause, another gasp, a longer pause, and then her chest stopped moving altogether. Jelbu shook her. Nothing. The two Sherpas looked at each other and knew. They had seen it before on other climbers. When breathing stops at 27,500 feet, there is no coming back. She was gone. This woman who had trained alone on temple steps because she could not afford professional facilities, who had refused to quit even when her body screamed at her to stop, was gone. Now the two Sherpas faced a terrible choice no one should ever have to make. At 27,500 feet, rescue was impossible. Helicopters cannot fly that high. The air is too thin. Carrying a body down from the death zone would take 8 or 10 hours of brutal work that would kill them too. They could stay with her and die, or they could leave her and live. They chose to live because otherwise their own families would be burying them as well. Jelbu secured her body to a cliff face with rope so it would not fall during the recovery operation that would come later. Then they turned away from Kalpana Dash and began descending toward Camp 4. 5 days later, on May 28, 2019, a team of Sherpas successfully retrieved her body in a dangerous recovery operation. They moved her remains down the mountain step by step to base camp. The body was then transported to Lukla and airlifted to Kathmandu for formalities. On June 2, 2019, Kalpana's body arrived at Biju Patnaik International Airport in Bhubaneswar, Odisha. Her brother Pradeep, who had traveled to Kathmandu to receive her remains, accompanied her home. At Kalinga Stadium complex, her body lay in state for about an hour while hundreds gathered to pay their final respects. The mountaineering equipment she had donated to the Odisha State Museum in 2017 was displayed in tribute. When I think about Kalpana's final moments at the balcony, I wonder what must have been going through her mind. Did she finally realize then that the Sherpas had been right 18 hours earlier? Did she think about her mother's photograph? About the promise she had made? Buishir Everest, mother. I'm coming from Everest. She did come from Everest. She kept her promise. She just did not come home the way she had meant to, And perhaps that is the cruelest part of this story. Kalpana Dash accomplished something extraordinary. She became the first person from Odisha to summit Everest. She returned in 2019 for the right reasons, to inspire women, to promote peace and cooperation, to prove that starting late and lacking resources need not prevent extraordinary achievement. She summited. She succeeded. She raised the flag. She took the photograph. And the success killed her. Summit fever is powerful. The drive to succeed after you have sacrificed everything can be overwhelming. And above 26,000 feet, your brain cannot always recognize when that drive has become a death sentence. The mountain does not care about promises or determination or decade-long dreams. It only cares about time. And Kalpana, who had trained harder than almost anyone, who had overcome more obstacles than most climbers ever face, simply ran out of time somewhere around the 18th hour of her climb.